Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Preeti Shirodkar, Associate Professor Communication and Soft Skills, MET Institute of Management. Today we are going to speak about issues of integration in host lands, select case studies from Africa and the Indian Ocean. Let us look at some interesting facts. In South Africa, Indians faced a lot of discrimination and racism both during British colonialism and the apartheid government. In Mauritius, on the other hand, Indians formed the majority with a large number of them being present there. In fact, they were the numerical strength of Mauritius, and it was the only place where they enjoyed a lot of political power. We will now set the context. The category Asian in colonial taxonomy encompassed a diverse group of people, including the Indians from the Indian subcontinent. The Asian migration trail to the coast of East Africa across the Indian Ocean is over 2,000 years old. This group of immigrants largely comprise the labor and imperial diaspora. Today, however, the Indians are politically integrated as citizens in their erstwhile host countries. Indians in Africa are, however, not a homogeneous community. They are divided sharply on lines of religion, the language they speak, their place of origin, the wealth they enjoy, their education and their class. Furthermore, their attachment to India has become by and large culturally symbolic, and their linkages to India are mainly for spiritual reasons or pilgrimages. Indians both in East and South Africa form a minority. Today, these 5th or 6th generation Africans are politically integrated as citizens into the countries where they are been residing and where their forefathers had emigrated in the 19th century. In the Mauritian context, however, the experience of the Indian diaspora is quite different, given that Mauritius is unique because it is the only country where persons of Indian origin, or PIOs as they are referred to, constitute about 70% of the population of the island state. However, this does not make them mainstream, as the answer to who constitutes a majority cannot be found in numbers, but with reference to power. Let us now first look at Indians in East Africa. The migration of Indians to East Africa was marked by certain distinct characteristics. The first, there was a continuous process of circular migration of male members in the late 19th century, and they began to settle in the latter half of the 19th century, mainly in the area of trading. Second, the colonial diaspora, that is, laborers who came from India, went there essentially to build the Uganda-Kenya railways in the then British Protectorate of East Africa. Third, a stream of Indians came on their own in search of economic opportunities and worked as clerks, accountants, craftsmen, agriculturalists, traders, amongst other vocations. Among these, those who were successful stayed on, while those who were not returned to India. We will now look at the economic and social issues that they faced. The Asian settlement in East Africa took place between 1880 and 1920. Their economic dominance far outweighed their numerical strength in the pre as well as the post-colonial period. In fact, in Uganda, Indians were less than 1% of the population in 1948. Moreover, they were a divided lot on lines of linguistic, regional and to some extent caste distinction. The British colonists added to this issue by building a stratified society wherein Europeans were at the top of the hierarchy. The Asians occupied the middle position and controlled much of the middle retail trade, and the indigenous Africans were at the bottom of the pyramid. This was the typical British divide and rule policy, which also created issues of social distinction in East Africa. Further, the three communities lived in separate residential areas with little or no interaction at the social level, and at the political level, a system of separate electorate and communal representation was practiced. In South Africa, Racism was overt and later institutionalized in 1948 through the official policy of apartheid. In East Africa, the Asians' position was undermined in the aftermath of decolonization once political power was transferred to the native Africans. The relations between the Asians and native Africans were therefore strained, primarily due to two reasons. First, the Africans were prejudiced against the Asians due to their economic prosperity of the Asians, whom they derogatorily referred to as Dukkawalas. Second, the Asians were higher up in the social hierarchy and they practiced social exclusiveness. This obviously built resentment. Let us consider how the situation was in the aftermath of independence. At the time of independence, the Indians in East Africa had to prove their loyalty to the newly independent states. They were confused on the matter of opting for African citizenship, and this was interpreted as a lack of trust and confidence in the African leadership. Those who applied for African citizenship, on the other hand, were seen as opportunists, while those who were indecisive were accused of holding on to their British passports like leeches or sitting on the fence. The Indians therefore seemed to have very little options and were in a problem whatever they chose. Besides, the African felt that many Asians became citizens in order to avoid or sidestep discriminatory policies and practices as also legislation. This in turn was perceived as disloyalty to the post-colonial regime in Africa, and the Indians were, as a result, victimized. President Idi Amin of Uganda pushed the logic of Indophobia to a totally different level. It was pushed to an extreme, and about 80,000 Asians were expelled. Most of these Asians fled to Britain. Assets worth millions of pounds belonging to the Asians were confiscated or nationalized in the immediate aftermath of the post-independence era. The African governments adopted the policy of nationalization and Africanization. Assets worth millions of pounds belonging to Asians were confiscated or nationalized in the immediate aftermath of the post-independence era. The African governments adopted the policy of nationalization and Africanization. Consequently, the total Asian population of East and Central Africa dropped from about 360,000 in 1961-62 to 178,000 in 1972, that is, by about 50%. Subsequent to the expulsion of the Ugandan Asians, it took over a decade and a half for the United Nations to adopt the Declaration of Human Rights of Individuals who are not nationals of the country in which they live, which was finally adopted on 13th December 1985. Having looked at Indians and their situation in East Africa, let us now turn to the situations of Indians in South Africa. Let us begin by looking at the historical backdrop of Indians in South Africa. In the year 2010, the Indian diaspora completed 150 years of their arrival in South Africa. British colonial powers contracted Indian labourers throughout the British Empire from 1860 to 1911. Among this, obviously, was Indians who found their way into South Africa. A second wave of Indian immigrants, also known as passenger Indians, the Khojas, Memons, Parsis, Sunni Vohras and Gujaratis, came from the 1880s onwards from the province of Gujarat. They became traders and businessmen, and they had paid their own fare, so they were not under any contract with British colonial rulers. The Indian traders in Africa essentially catered to the needs of the indentured Indian populace. By 1920, the Indian population reached 130,000 and surpassed the white population. It was not surprising that the white traders felt threatened by the prosperity of the Indian immigrants and lobbied for restrictions to be placed on the Indian trading community. As a result, in response to this, the Natal colonial government adopted discriminatory legislative practices and restricted trading activities of the Indians to clearly demarcated Indian areas. Furthermore, Racial discrimination and residential segregation in coolie compounds and a lack of basic rights characterized the existence of the Indians from the late 1880s until the formation of a democratic South Africa in 1994. It was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi who came and fought against this through satyagraha. Under apartheid, there were 4 distinct racial groups. These were the whites, the blacks, the coloreds and Indians. As a consequence of discriminatory legislations such as the Asiatic Land Tenure Act of 1946 and subsequently the Group Areas Act of 1950, the residential areas of the 4 racial groups were segregated. This spatial compression in the newly set up Indian township probably marks the beginning of what came to be officially known as the Indian community. Indians were granted certain privileges such as benefits in the labour market, setting up of separate educational institutions. This provided them with an opportunity to attain higher education and professional skills. Until the dismantlement of apartheid in 1994 and the setting up of a democratic, non-racial South Africa, the question of equality of South African Indians did not arise. Let us look now at the democratic South Africa and the situation of the Indians there post 1994 and beyond. The first democratic election of 1994 ushered in a lot of hope for all disempowered non-white communities who were by then a numerical majority. Nelson Mandela, the first president, laid the foundations of a rainbow nation, and the acceptance of multiculturalism resonates in the provisions of the rights-based new constitution of the Republic of South Africa. Despite the respect and acceptance of people with varied ethnic origins since 1994, there have been tenuous relations between the blacks and the other minority groups, that is, the coloreds and the Indians. Moreover, the Indian community in South Africa is at a crossroad. They comprise only 2.5% of the total population of the country. The Indian community, however, has an economic presence that far outweighs their numerical strength. Within themselves, though, they are a stratified lot in terms of class and economic status. Despite a shared history and coexistence in the same country for over 150 years, interaction between the two, that is Indians and the blacks, is limited to the political sphere and in public places. However, in a significant development post 1994, the policy of racial segregation has been banned. Let us now move on from South Africa to Indians in Mauritius. Unlike in countries of East Africa and South Africa, the people of Indian origin, or the PIOs, in Mauritius are categorized as the Indo-Mauritians, and these constitute 68% of the total population according to the Central Statistics Office data of 2009. Moreover, Mauritius is the only country where the Hindu-dominated political parties have commanded political power since the country gained independence from the British in 1968. Let us consider now the historical background of Mauritius. A notable feature of Mauritius is that, unlike other post-colonial countries, the island state did not have an indigenous population. It was colonized by 4 European powers: the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French and the British. Between 1834 and 1912, 4,53,063 Indian immigrants were dispatched to meet the shortage of labour in the sugarcane plantations of Mauritius. These indentured labourers formed a part of the labour and imperial diaspora, given that they were also recruited to assist the British in the conquest of the island. These immigrants came from a cross-section of rural society, and there has been a sharp differentiation between the Dravidians there, that is the Tamilians and the Telugu population mostly, and the Aryans, who constitute the Biharis, the Marathis and the Bengalis. The Indian diaspora in Mauritius is thus marked by certain characteristics that differentiates them vastly from other Indian diasporas. Let us look at the heterogeneity of the country, that is Mauritius. At the time of independence, the constitution of Mauritius divided the people into four main ethnic groups: the Hindus, the Muslims, the Sino-Mauritians, and the general population. The first two groups, that is the Indo-Mauritian populace, are considered to be descendants of the indentured laborers. A small number of Hakka Chinese people, that is about 3% of the population, who immigrated for trade and commerce in the mid-19th century, are known as the Sino-Mauritians, while the general population is a residual category and are known as the Creoles, who are of African origin. This category includes people of French descent, the Anglo-Mauritians, as well as the 50,000 people of African descent who are believed to have come as slaves by the end of the 18th century. In the 2009 census, the Mauritians were regrouped into Indo-Mauritians, that is the Muslim and Hindu PIOs, the Creoles, the Sino-Mauritians, and the Franco-Mauritians. For the first time in the elections held in November 2014, it was not mandatory for the electoral candidates to declare their ethnic group. We will now consider the religious divide in Mauritius. Further, the Mauritians are divided along religious lines in addition to the community lines. The Hindus and Muslims stand on one end of the divide, while the Tamil Christians identify closely with the Creoles, who are Catholics. Religious freedom is a constitutionally guaranteed right and strategy to attain peace in this multi-religious community. Creole is considered a uniting factor there. As the indentured people were recruited from different regions of the country, they spoke multiple Indian dialects. Creole, however, served as the lingua franca and was spoken by 86% of the people, while Bhojpuri was spoken by 5.3% and English was spoken by only 2.6% people. This goes on to reflect how Indianness has been effaced to facilitate coexistence in the multicultural context of Mauritius. Mauritius is known for its unity in diversity. Let us see how. The society is divided on the rural-urban axis and class or economic status. However, despite this, the heterogeneity within and between groups is evident, and the country puts forward a picture of a unitary nation symbolized by the national flag. The final aspect of Mauritius, which is very interesting, is its diversified economic base. Though the Mauritians of Indian origin are dominant in the political arena by virtue of their numerical strength, as mentioned twice earlier, the economic base that they belong to is diversified. While several PIOs work in bureaucracy, trade, the education sector and agriculture, many of the Indo-Mauritians continue to work in the agricultural sector as wage laborers. Though the Indians are in a numerical majority and have been a dominant power politically, they have not legislated in favor of the PIOs to change the status quo. As a result, political parties are forced to pursue coalition strategies by creating compromises and tactical alliances. Of the total number of overseas Indians, the bulk is composed of NRIs who are not a part of the old diaspora, but they are essentially expatriate Indians who have moved to Africa in the past decade or so for economic opportunities. To conclude, the important facts that we need to remember are that despite their presence in the three nations since the 19th century, and we are referring here to East Africa, South Africa and Mauritius, the Indians are not totally integrated. What they are integrated in is in the area of culture and economics, but politically they are still a diverse lot, and they are not allowed to assimilate and integrate entirely into the population of these three nations. Thank you.